with other leagues. Now, Erica has quite a presentation to get through and a lot of information. So we are asking, however, if you don't mind, put your comments or questions in the chat, and we're going to try and get through the presentation, and then we'll certainly get to all the questions, and we'll answer as many as we can and see how it goes from there. So for now, and so I ask everybody to put it on mute. I'm sure we love your dogs and cats too, but we'd rather not hear them during the presentation. And I'm going to turn it over to Erica then. Thanks.
Great. Thanks so much, Laura. And thank you so much, Tiffany. As Laura said, we're really excited to be working with the Delaware League on this presentation. So without further ado, let's hop right into it. So I will be asking you all throughout to engage with a couple of questions that I have via the chat. So just kind of keep that in mind. My computer's moving very slowly, so hold on. Go. Okay, there we go. All right, so this presentation is actually a presentation it's based off a presentation that was created by the US League in collaboration with the Algorithmic Transparency Institute. So if you all are interested in giving a similar presentation to folks in your area, you certainly can do so. And I'm happy to share these slides or share where I got the original slides from. So as Laura said, my name is Erica Smitka. I'm Deputy Director with the League of Women Voters of New York State. Tonight, we are going to talk about a lot of things, but we'll talk a little bit about the landscape when it comes to mis and disinformation. We will walk through defining the problem, talk about responsible engagement, and then a way that you can actively participate in combating this mis and disinformation, that is. So I think it's really important that we start off by defining the problem. Sorry, I seem to be having a couple of, all right, my computer seems to be lagging here. So I think before I started doing a lot of research on this, I actually hadn't thought about what the difference is between mis and disinformation. So for those of you who already knew this definition, kudos to you. But misinformation is false or inaccurate information, and while disinformation is false information that's intended to mislead, intentionally intended to deceive. Propaganda issued by the government is one example of this. But I want to turn it back to you all before we really get into things. So what concern motivates you the most to help your community address mis and disinformation, especially as we're in the lead up to the 2024 election? So you can plug any thoughts you have on this just right into the chat. I'll share a concern of mine to get people going. I think there always seems to be at least a few pieces of mis or disinformation that circulate around how our election process works. And we may get calls in the office. I'll talk about one example later of someone saying, oh, I thought X when really it's Y. And whatever that is, it might dissuade someone from getting to the polls or dissuade them from casting their ballot effectively. So we've got a couple of people adding things in the chat, how people believe some of these things, absolutely. Yes, that people believe what they might read on Facebook without realizing they're misled. The idea of a stolen election, absolutely a huge concern for me. Voters who might be educated with wrong info that's incorrect, that could damage their decision regarding voting. A lot of disinformation, believing everything on the internet is accurate, different methods of voting are fraudulent. Exactly. Yes, yeah, we've got a lot of really good examples here, and a lot of reasons that kind of highlight why this is going to be a huge issue as we get closer and closer to November 2024. So unfortunately, misinformation spread on social media really has become a fact of life. It fuels polarization and hate. It drives down trust in our major institutions. It amplifies fringe sciences and conspiracies, and in some cases, it can even incite violence. Almost every, well, I think I can say every, political and social issue that we hope to address today is impacted in some way by the threat of false and misleading claims that can confuse the public. Unfortunately, this is a huge problem, and there is no silver bullet. There's no one-stop shop that will be the answer to this issue. There's no policy that social media platforms can implement. There's no law that the government can pass that would truly address all the ways in which mis and disinformation have affected and will continue to affect our society, which means that we've got to look at it in a slightly different way. So instead, we have to look at this issue from a more holistic approach, right? So we all share the responsibility for addressing misinformation and disinformation when we see it. And it's important that we kind of cultivate this shared sense of civic responsibility, right? It's your civic responsibility to vote. So it's also your civic responsibility to be able to understand and identify harmful and misleading messages, and then share that with other folks in your community. It's important that we are able to kind of invest in this in a constructive way and find common ground so that we can engage the whole of our society in this effort, because it's not going to be something that can be led by one person, right? And so what does that phrase I just used, whole of society, what does that really mean? So it essentially just acknowledges that we all share the civic responsibility to combat mis and disinformation that's disrupting our discourse. It's embracing the fact that everyone, including all of you on this call, have been and can be affected by mis and disinformation, regardless of your political perspective. It's also important that we acknowledge that misinformation looks different in each and every community, and that it's important that we tackle it everywhere. So we often hear about or talk about misinformation within sometimes mainstream English speaking, often white spaces. But what we know from the research that's out there is that mis and disinformation in some cases can primarily target individuals of color, and especially voters of color. And I'll talk a little bit about some of those examples as we get further into the presentation. But one of the ways that we can effectively combat this mis and disinformation, which I feel like I've already said about 70 times, and you're gonna hear it 70 more, is to empower folks within each and every community of our society to develop an approach that resonates with them to combat misinformation that they can then share with the folks in their own circle. And so that includes, tailoring that content so that it's culturally appropriate and community specific. So first, let's talk about what mis and disinformation looks like. And some of this might seem really obvious to you. You might feel like you know some of this, but it's really important. I want to emphasize how important it is for you to be able to identify this, because as I said, every single person on this call has probably looked at or bought into mis and disinformation without realizing it, right? So it's good to really go over the basics and learn some of the key tactics for identifying this information. So we'll go over the different forms of problematic content, which you can see listed here. The one thing I want to highlight before we get into that is just that information doesn't have to be false to be a problem. So I'll talk about that in just a little bit. Okay. I should also warn you that the slides I'm about to show, some of the words I'm about to speak are words that are, things that I would never, they might contain problematic, they do contain problematic content, and they're things that I would never personally say or express or believe, but they're good examples of mis and disinformation. So, all right, so let's see. The first one that we're going to talk about is missing context. So this is one that we often see a lot, right? So Missing context is anytime a quote is shared or statistics are shared without the surrounding statement or without contextual information that would give you all the information you need to know to be able to effectively understand what someone is saying. So we see this a lot in statistics, and this tweet is a good example. The tweet reads, "Illegal aliens are far more likely to commit federal crimes based on statistics. They're 7% of the population, yet they commit 72% of drug possession, 33% of money laundering, 29% of drug trafficking, 22% of murders, and 18% of fraud." So if you think that this statement is true, I want you to just put a note in the chat. Okay, I've got one false. I've got one true, but I have many falses. Louise would be correct. This statement actually is true. But what's missing? The context, right? So these statistics were accurate for the year in which they were shared, and they're even backed up by government data. But the one key phrase that this statement makes that makes it misleading is the term federal crimes. So we know, based on a ton of other research, that non-citizens have substantially lower crime rates than US-born citizens. However, non-citizens are consistently overrepresented in federal crime data, which is what was used to make this claim. These types of crimes are rarely prosecuted at the federal level, but because it was, the crime may have been committed by a non-citizen, that's what raises it to the level of a federal crime, which is why we see this drastic overrepresentation in these numbers. And so as a result, statements like this can both be true, but also exceptionally misleading in a way that really distorts the conversation. So that's missing logic. Our next one is going to be faulty logic. So this is an example. Faulty logic can come in many forms, I should say. It often comes in the form of an argument to convince you of something, but it might make you jump to the wrong conclusion. So the example here is a picture of Tim Allen. We don't know if Tim Allen ever said this. He probably didn't, but there's a photo of him and then the words, "You want me to take the dang vaccine? Mail it to me and I'll vaccinate myself and mail back the paperwork stating I'm fully vaccinated. You trust me, right?" Just like mail-in voting. Now, we all know, and I think we can all rationally think about the fact that vaccinating yourself in the privacy of your own home is absolutely not comparable to filling out a mail-in ballot and mailing that back to your board of elections. But that's the logic line that this is trying to get you to think along the same lines of, right? But we're comparing apples and oranges. So it's really just illogical to compare the two, but the message exploits some underlying skepticism about mail-in voting to kind of get you to start to critique it by comparing it to, at-home vaccines. So other types of faulty logic arguments might be like a red herring, or I've heard of a straw man argument, anything to really misdirect your attention away from the real problem to an invented one. So the next one we have is an example of hate or dog whistles. So this is a meme, and it says a fifth grader from Alabama and a fifth grader from Maine get into a fight. Who wins? The fifth grader from Alabama, because he's 18. Hate and dog whistles. This one always gets multiple laughs. Hate and dog whistles. The meme. They don't have to use like explicitly derogatory language, but the message is still embedded with hate nonetheless, right? In some cases, the hate can be even less subtle than this. So a good example of this is a dog whistle, which a dog whistle is something that only a dog can hear, right? And so it would be a message put out by a specific group intended to reach others within their community, but that folks who aren't paying attention or who just might not be aware probably wouldn't catch on to the fact that what someone's saying could be offensive or derogatory. So the first example that always comes to my mind, it was the "Let's Go Brandon" slogan that folks were using a couple of years ago, which was uh, an attack on Joe Biden. But it was, I remember when I first saw it, I was like, who the heck is this Brandon guy? He's getting so much support. But it obviously was intended to kind of be a calling card for folks who thought this one particular way. So again, this doesn't, hate doesn't have to be overly derogatory for it to be that way, or for it to appeal to hateful groups or organizations. So next one is my favorite, conspiracy theories. Conspiracy theories are out there. We all know about conspiracy theories. A pretty common tell for a conspiracy theory is if someone's claiming that a particular situation is the result of decisions made by powerful people with ulterior motives, right? That's the kind of the common trope we hear when we think of conspiracy theories. So the tweet here, that's an example, is use your own pen when you go in and vote on August 2nd in Arizona. Bring a black or blue tip pen with you. Do not use the felt tip pen they will try to give you. Share this. Arizonans need to read this. And this is something that we had, that we experienced, calls directly to our New York State League office asking this question exactly. Folks being really concerned about the pen that they were given when they went into the voting booths to vote, and concerned that the machine wouldn't correctly read their ballot if they used the felt tip pen that was given to them. Is this the case? Absolutely not. Was this refuted by the New York State Board of Elections? It definitely was. Yet this lie, this conspiracy, still gained a lot of traction in New York, enough so that we got, at least a couple or a handful of calls about it in our office. So conspiracy theories, there's a ton of them. I think we can all think of a couple of good conspiracy theories. The last one I want to talk about is probably one of the more common ones. So this is information that's old or out of date, which is often hard to recognize when it's reshared on social media. So this is a Facebook post. It says, amazing but not shocking at all anymore. Nearly 200,000 Florida voters may not be citizens. And it was posted in 2018, obviously to get voters to think about this for the 2018 election. But as we can very clearly see from the title of the article, this data actually came from 2012. So whether this data was accurate or not, the fact that it's so out of date means that it truly has, it's not applicable to the conversation being had here. The other thing is that we'll often see older out-of-date posts coming from what we consider reputable sources. So this came from an NBC News affiliate in Miami. You might think of NBC News and think of a reputable news source, right? So you may be more prone to believing what you see from this source. But again, if it's old and out of date, it really doesn't matter. And it can lead to again, folks coming to the wrong conclusions about what's happening currently with an issue. So check the date. Check the date. Overall, it's really critical to kind of recognize each and every form of this content. And again, it doesn't have to be false to create problems. So I want to talk a little bit about a couple of examples that we've seen in New York State specifically. I was telling Tiffany before everyone got on the call that I was looking for some really great examples in Delaware. And I'm sure that there are some really good examples out there, but the fact of the matter is Delaware County, Pennsylvania has a lot of problems with mis and disinformation when it comes to elections. So that's what just continued to pop up for me over and over and over again. So I will turn the mic over to folks from Delaware at some point and hopefully hear a little bit more from you. But I figured it could still be helpful for me to share examples that we've seen here in New York State that directly relate to our elections. So the first is that we are actually still continuing to see is, I believe since last summer, we have seen folks go door to door impersonating election officials and talking to voters claiming that they are illegally registered to vote. Or the most recent example was someone going door to door claiming to be an official from the New York State or the County Board of Elections, claiming that someone's petition signature was incorrect or it didn't count. Is this true? Absolutely not. I love to say that, which is absolutely true. The New York State Board of Elections, our County Board of Elections, do not have they don't have the time, they don't have the money, they don't have the staff to go door to door talking to people about their voter registration status. I wish that they did, but they simply don't. And this was a very clear example of misinformation and disinformation being spread on a really a face-to-face basis, which we don't always expect. We got another example of this, as I said, in Saratoga County just a few weeks ago. The other example that we're seeing is we're seeing organizations at town halls across New York State claiming that elections in their area are fraudulent and that the voter rolls are wrong. Is this true? Absolutely not. We have many reasons why we know New York State runs safe and secure elections, and I'm happy to share a couple of resources at the end of this that can prove to voters just why they're safe and secure. But this growing sense or this growing conversation that our elections are fraudulent and that our voter rolls cannot be counted on only really seek to sow distrust in our election system and our election process, which means that when someone who might have been on the fence about going out to vote hears information like this, they might think, well, they probably won't this year, right? And so that's one less voter that we see make it out to the polls. The other thing I want to talk about is some of these examples targeted specifically diverse voters. So you may all remember the robocalls that were sent out of I want to say 2020 in New York State, but also 4 other states, claiming that yes, it was 2020. Many voters were going to be voting by mail that year, but this robocall said that if they voted by mail, all of their information would be uploaded into this database that would then be publicly accessible and kind of like nefarious, insinuating that nefarious things would happen with their personal information. Is that true? Absolutely not. Voting by mail is just as safe as voting by mail is just as safe as if you were to head to the polls. But these robocalls specifically targeted Black voters, especially in New York State, which meant that we saw fewer Black voters and voters of color show up to the polls that year or submit a mail-in ballot. A resource that I want to highlight for everybody is a website called Eckies, which does specific research on mis and disinformation within the Hispanic community. And they've got a lot of really great articles, a lot of really great research work that they've done about how mis and disinformation, especially around elections, is targeting the Hispanic community and harming the community. So check that out when you have a chance. So what does this mean for New York State? What does this mean for us on a kind of a wider scale, right? Nationwide. So not only in New York State, but nationwide, the Brennan Center did a report which found that this is having a serious effect on election workers. So 1 in 3 election workers has left their job, at least in part due to fears for their safety, increased threats, or intimidation. A few months ago, the New York Times had an article talking about how, I believe it was in 5 states, boards of elections, workers at boards of elections were mailed envelopes that contained fentanyl. This thankfully didn't happen in New York State, but it's a really clear example of how, someone might fear for their safety if they're an election worker in New York State or anywhere else. And then in addition to that, 2 out of 3 election officials believe that false information is making their job more dangerous. So what does this mean? It means that it's harder to retain staff, which means it's harder for boards of elections to keep up on training. And it's frankly just harder for our elections to run smoothly, right? We need the staff and we need folks out on the ground, whether they are poll workers or whether they're more long-term staff with the boards of elections. We know we need this staff in order to run our elections smoothly. So let's talk a little bit about, I want to reflect on, well, I do want to actually, before we do that, I want to hear from you all. So if folks could plug into the chat a few examples of, oh, it looks like we have some examples, but if folks can plug into the chat, what experiences or what tactics have you most recently experienced out of the ones that we talked about that are listed? So Barb shares an example of a dog whistle in her local high school with a hand signal that students were using. That was a different way to use an incredibly offensive slur against folks of color. Any other examples that folks want to share? No? All right. Oh, that's a great one, Diane. So Diane mentioned the AI robocall where the voice and the image were, it was Joe Biden saying that there was no need to vote, when in fact that was not Joe Biden saying those words. That's a classic, it's a very good example. New York State recently passed a bill that will help combat some of AI generated images in our election system, but it's only going to continue to become more difficult. So I'm sure that will be a topic as we get closer to November. Okay, so let's talk about what makes this stick. Why does this work, right? We're all incredibly smart people. We think we can spot these things when we see them in the wild, but why does it stick, and why is it so pervasive? So there's a couple of reasons, but today we'll talk about three. So the first is motivated reasoning, which I think a lot of folks are probably aware of, right? You're predisposed to believe in ideals that align with our political beliefs and our social values. So when we learn that someone we trust has done something we might not agree with, we are 10 times more likely to overlook what they have done because we know them as, you know, this trustworthy and an upstanding individual. So you really want to make sure that you kind of that you think about some of these things and these reasons why disinformation sticks with people as we are looking, or as you're out, you know, looking at examples that might be examples of mis or disinformation. So the second is probably the most common. This is an emotional appeal. So any content that appeals to our emotion kind of can very easily trigger a reflex, and you can jump to a conclusion that is not always supported by facts. So if you think this is the case, it's really important to take a step back, consider why. If you see a message, it makes you really angry, take a minute, think about, why does this message make me so angry? And think about if your emotions are clouding out some of the critical thinking you need to do about the information that you're receiving. The most effective disinformation campaigns trigger powerful emotions that can be really difficult to overcome with logic alone. And then the last one is going to be easy answers. There's a lot of big and confusing problems out there, and it's sometimes, you know, much easier to be able to explain that problem away with an easy answer. So I think a good example of this is climate change is a huge problem, right? But if I think climate change doesn't exist, well, problem solved, right? there's no issue that needs to be addressed there. So, you know, picking up an easy answer is sometimes an easy kind of out for folks. So frequently, some of these messages can use the same strategies at the same time. So you might find something that uses motivated reasoning, but it's also an emotional appeal. And emotional appeals, as I said, you know, that's what we see most often. There's a lot of reasons why people create disinformation, but so I'm really not going to get into them all too specifically. But the primary reasons are those that we see here, right? It's a political agenda for profit, or for pride, or pride in a community, or as a prank. Okay, so now that we have kind of a clear understanding of what mis and disinformation looks like in a variety of ways, we can talk about how to address it. So a lot of different kind of techniques I'm going to talk about. I think the most important thing to think about is use your own best judgment, right? You are the person in that situation. You know your own community. You know what surrounds the different factors that could have an impact on your situation. And so just think critically about that before acting. The first rule is don't engage. When in doubt, don't engage with mis and disinformation. And I think that kind of seems counterintuitive to a lot of what we've been talking about. But I'll tell you why this is so important. So often the risks and the obstacles will far outweigh any of the benefits that you see when you engage with someone spreading mis or disinformation. Sometimes there's a personal toll that you can experience if there's backlash against you, if you're doing this on a public social media platform. There may be social consequences, but quite often the most damaging effect is that your effort to respond to someone can have the opposite of the effect that you intended. And it could only cause someone to dig in and reinforce the narrative that they are correct and you are incorrect. The other one is going to be, seems obvious, right? It's probably the number one rule in the playground: don't argue. For many of the same reasons, right? When you argue with someone directly, you try to contradict what they're saying. Folks will often get even more defensive. They'll be pushed deeper into their own beliefs. They'll kind of dig in and really fiercely defend their beliefs. So again, it can have the adverse effect of actually increasing their belief in a concept instead of getting them to think critically about that. The next one is one that I think is one of the more important ones. So I think especially when we see misinformation on social media, it can be we might want to. It can be enticing to want to downvote that, or to say a comment kind of proving why this information is false. But it really depends on what the information being shared is, because the last thing we want to do is amplify this message. The way that social media platforms work, that by commenting, even if you're downvoting, sharing, hitting dislike, whatever you might be doing, it only serves to further promote that message, and it makes it more likely that that message is going to show up on someone else's newsfeed. So by engaging with that message in any way, shape, or form, we often make it so that even more people see this source of mis or disinformation. Make sure that you're not repeating the language of the falsehood or the false claim that folks are making. So language really has power, and by using the terminology created by folks that are spreading misinformation, we end up ceding some of that power to them, and it's especially important when it comes to the terminology used around the safety of our election systems, things like election fraud. I think I see often even the terms election security are starting to be used even more and more by folks who are claiming that elections are not secure, and that our election system is quote unquote rigged. And so by repeating some of these same words, we're again building power behind this movement, or this idea that our election systems are in fact fraudulent. Don't embarrass someone. If you embarrass someone, especially with derogatory language, or even not derogatory language, but you say that they're a knucklehead, right? You're still embarrassing someone, especially if it's on a social media platform. And it's likely to, again, cause someone to kind of just dig in further to their beliefs, and it's really not going to result in a positive or a responsive person on the other end. And then the last one is make sure that you're not contradicting with only a fact check. And this goes back to the example of mis and disinformation, the kind of the missing context, right? So if you simply give one snapshot, but you're not painting the full picture for someone, it again just isn't going to allow someone to be able to understand the whole context, to be able to understand why you're saying what you're saying, and why that's important or why that's true. So if I rattle off a fact from the State Board of Elections, instead of saying something along the lines of, I read this great article put out by the State Board of Elections on this date. It said this, which came from this source. You guys kind of get the point, right? It's you can't just spew one piece of information without the context necessary for folks to understand that information. Okay, so I talked a lot about how you shouldn't engage in some of this context, but when should you engage? So there's 3 times when you should consider engaging with misinformation, and you can see those examples up here. But we're gonna talk about them quickly. So the first is the tipping point. So when a narrative has crossed the thresholds, and the threshold is defined as when something becomes well known, widely discussed, or if it's clearly no longer being isolated within a small community, the idea has crossed a tipping point. So I think the example used here is if something has more than 1 million shares or views or likes on social media, it's probably really starting to get some traction, right? So that means it's crossed the tipping point, and it's absolutely worth it for you to engage. It's really subjective, but you're kind of want to think about things like, can this narrative no longer be contained? And if so, it really needs a response. So the other thing that you want to think about is a knowledge gap, which I actually don't have up here. Well, this kind of falls into data deficit, but when misinformation exposes a clear data deficit that you can fill with good information, so that people you reach aren't susceptible to the false information because they've already been reached with that good information. So I'll give a great example here. So I think 2 years ago, we saw growing conversations in New York State specifically that folks were having about elections being fraudulent, or not really understanding exactly how our election process worked. And so the New York State League, in conjunction with the Brennan Center, pushed out 2 really informative pamphlets that walked New York State voters through exactly what happens when they, from point A to point Z. So when they go to register to vote, to when after they drop their ballot in the ballot box, and what happens to it after. And so it talked about each and every step of the process and why each step of that process was safe and secure. And our goal was to reach people before they got the information that was false, before they heard from those folks showing up at town halls saying our election systems are fraudulent, they don't work. We wanted to make sure folks knew exactly why our election systems work. So that when they hear that bad information, they can say, well, that doesn't make sense. I know that a team of bipartisan election officials looks at every voter registration application that comes in, and looks at all these pieces of information to decide whether that person is an eligible voter in New York State. So that's just an example. The other one, or the last one, is resolving obstacles. So when you're directly engaging with someone, and the misleading information creates a practical obstacle to moving forward. So an example that I'll give here that I'll also use a little bit later is that we often see this when registering voters, right? So you might have someone say, I'm not going to register to vote because I think my vote doesn't count. I think that I've heard if I use the wrong pen, the voting machine won't count my ballot. Reasons someone might give for not wanting to register to vote is a clear example of when you should engage with that person by providing them the right information and hopefully encouraging them to register to vote so that they head out to the polls. So whatever that obstacle might look like, and I'll actually share my example in a little bit here when we talk about tactics. So these are some times when you should consider engaging with misinformation, but how are you going to do that? So it's mainly through this idea of counter messaging. And the first one we've talked about a little bit already. So the first one is pre-bunking, getting ahead of rumors by exposing misinformation so that people are aware of them before they hear them in the wild, right? The wild could be social media, it could be from their neighbor, it could be from, whomever. But so it's really important for you to take a look at some examples of this within your own community. What are some falsehoods that you're hearing folks share? And how can you get out there with the right messaging and the correct message so that you can reach folks who, maybe have heard the misinformation but don't quite believe it, or you can reach folks before they've even heard that misinformation. And the example of getting to folks with that knowledge of how our voting system works is a perfect example of pre-bunking. So there's a couple of tips and tricks about what to pre-bunk, how to design it, and then how and where to share that, which I can share these slides with you all so that you have them. Don't have to write this down. So counter messaging also continues with the old, another good example is this way to phrase, or this way to structure a conversation, which is the old compliment sandwich, right? That's how I like to think about this one. So the idea of the compliment sandwich is if I have bad news to report to Laura, Laura wrote a book and it's really not good, right? I want to start out by saying something positive to Laura. I'm going to give her the actual feedback I have, and then I'm going to end with something positive. So I'm going to say, Laura, I can tell you really put a ton of effort into this book. It just really doesn't make any sense. But I think we can get back to the drawing board and really workshop this into something great, because I can see your passion through your writing, right? So I gave Laura a compliment, I told her the harsh truth, and then I gave her another compliment. And that just kind of sandwiches the fact you're going to want to give to somebody. And that's what you're doing here, right? You're giving somebody a fact. You're going to warn them about whatever that myth is, whatever that misinformation is or disinformation. You're going to dig into why that myth or that piece of information is false or inaccurate, and then you're going to finish with a fact, so that the first thing someone hears is a fact, and then the last thing they hear is a fact, right? And that's hopefully what they leave with. So this is just one example of how what that might look like. So I'm taking a look at my notes. I have another example here that I'll share with you all. So a voting related example would be New York State elections are safe and secure, and all ballots are accurately counted. You may have heard a rumor spread by bad actors looking to sow distrust in our election process by falsely stating that absentee ballots are lost in the mail and are not counted. However, each and every step of the process is safe and secure and monitored by a bipartisan team of election officials. Here, take a look at our one-pager, and here's how you can track your absentee ballot on the web and see it move through each step of the process. So that's an example of a counter message and kind of like a fact sandwich, right? And this is an example of a conversation I had with someone when they called the office. Which I will use as we look at another way that you can structure a conversation. And that conversation was, we had a guy call our office, and he said, listen, I really want to get to the polls this year, but I can't remember if he said his neighbor, whomever it was. He said, I heard that at the end of the day, they put all of the voting machines into a van, and then they drive that van down to the river, and then they dump a few in. And I was like, okay. First of all, I asked him questions. I said, wow, I have never heard that before. Where did you hear that? And I was starting to build a relationship with this person. I was starting to show empathy and get him to trust me. Because we will always trust a message that comes from a trusted source, right? I'm 10 times more likely to believe something my sister tells me than I am some random guy who shows up at my door. So that element of trust is crucial. And that's why you combating misinformation within your own circle is the most impactful. And this is the kind of conversation you can have with someone within your own circle. But I just happen to be having it with this guy talking about the votes going into the river. So I asked him where he had heard this from, why he believes this, and he explained a little bit more about what he thought. And then I showed empathy. I said, I think you make a really great point. Actually, up until a few years ago, I really wasn't sure exactly what happened to my ballot when I put it into the ballot box. So you're asking some really good questions. I tried to get a better idea of, maybe why he was predisposed to believe this. But ultimately, I shared the facts with him and I shared my own personal perspective. So I said, I had the same questions. I reached out to our state board of elections, to my local board of elections, and they talked me through exactly what happens when my ballot gets dropped into the ballot box. I actually signed up to be a poll worker, so I get to see what happened for myself and see all the processes that are in place to make sure our elections are safe and secure. At the end of the conversation, this guy did decide to register to vote, which was great. But this is just an example, a niche example of a way in which you could have a conversation just like this. I know I'm already running up on time, so I'm going to do these last few slides really quickly so we have time for questions. There's a lot of different tools that we can provide to you that can be helpful in talking to your own community about this, either doing a similar training or just educating people out in the when you're registering voters. There's a great training on the US website through their Democracy Truth Project. And just a whole host of other things that we can send out to folks if they're interested. US also has a great PSA that I won't play for you all, but you can use it for this election. It essentially talks about why it's really important that folks are aware before we head into the election year, and why they've got to kind of make sure they're not misled by bad information. And then the US also has a really great program called the Civic Listening Corps, which is exactly for mis and disinformation. So you can sign up for the program. They have a number of trainings that they're running all the time. And the program will teach you how to, some of the things that we've talked about here today, but how to observe and identify mis and disinformation in your own community, and then ultimately report it into a database, identifying problematic content and flagging that content for folks. So here is the QR code for you to join that, or you can just search LWV US and Civic Listening Corps. And with that, I am going to wrap up and we'll open the floor for questions.
Erica, I found a couple of questions in the chat that I thought you might want to address, but I do, and I think you missed saying, but if you said it, it doesn't hurt to say it again. That the examples that you were talking about, the brochures and things that we pulled together with the Brennan Center, the election security materials, those are on our website as well. Under local league resources, there's a drop down for regional trainings. And as I said, this was a presentation that Erica did during our regional training workshops. And those handouts are listed on that page as well. So if anyone would like to see those, I don't believe were they all specific to New York State, or you might need to do a little
state election law.
Yeah, so you might have to do a little editing for Delaware, but at least it gives you an example of something that you might want to create, something like that. But anyway, the questions I saw, and then we can do, we can take some others too. Erica, somebody asked, is the primary difference between mis and disinformation intentionality? And does it mean, if that's true, does it mean that dealing with the sources of each of those are different?
Dealing with the sources of each of those are different. That's a really great question. Yeah, and I think yes. I think the answer is yes, right? So it is intentionality. And so it's going to be a lot easier when you're talking with someone who just simply doesn't know the facts and figures behind what they're referencing, versus talking to someone who is intentionally looking to deceive. And then that conversation really isn't going anywhere. I think one of the most important things we can identify when talking to folks about mis and disinformation is honestly when to disengage. Some conversations are going to be really impactful and really fruitful, but identifying when a conversation isn't going anywhere, and saying, my go-to line is, we'll have to agree to disagree. Great to talk to you. Say, give them whatever it is, a friendly, have a great rest of your day, and turn the other way. Because sometimes just won't go anywhere.
Great. Another question is, does the First Amendment protect disinformation?
I saw that question. That's a really good question. And I truthfully don't know the answer. I'm not a lawyer. I'm certainly not a constitutional law lawyer. There are laws within each, well, actually there's laws in 11 states, I think, that combats against disinformation, but not in New York State and not in Delaware. I can look for the source where I found that. But it starts to get into, then you got to consider like what's libel, what's considered slander, and I just don't know the specifics around there. But I would say that there aren't enough laws out there that could kind of work to combat this in a way that works with the First Amendment.
Great. Okay, and this question I love because it lets you boast about what we did, because how did we distribute the election security information? And we had some good stories of what happened with those. So I'm happy for you to answer that one.
Yeah, it was a really positive process. So as we do so many of our things with the league, our local leagues are our heart and soul, right? They're our boots on the ground, and they're the ones that have such great relationships that they've built with local boards of elections. So we distributed the materials to our local leagues. Local leagues reached out to election commissioners within their county board of elections and got them all of the materials that we created, along with some additional information. And as Laura said, the responses were I think a lot more positive than we expected. We heard from a lot of folks a lot of election commissioners who said, wow, this is incredible. I think, somebody can correct me, Ulster County, they posted this poster that we created at every single poll site within the county. We had other boards of elections that put it on their website. We had just a lot of really positive responses from commissioners who frankly seemed overloaded and overworked, but acknowledged what a huge issue this is, especially in their area. So it was we used our local leagues, and it was super successful.
Yeah, and I think that goes to one of your arguments, Erica, that they were very factual. We didn't get into, they were factual as to this is how it actually works. We weren't trying to argue that they were safe, they were secure. We weren't trying to get into those kind of things. We just gave them the information of this is what happens when you vote. And I think that's why they were so successful, because it was hard because it was one of the counties that usually isn't very receptive to our materials and all, that really liked them and appreciated them too. So we know that they weren't interpreted as partisan. They weren't interpreted as, helping the election or by any means in a certain way. They were very factual. And I think that's why they were so well received. There's one question. What do you say to believers of the documentary called 2000 Mules? I don't know that. Yeah.
I've
Do
never
you
seen
know?
this documentary. No.
So
I
don't know if Sharon is, if you'd like to say something more about that, unmute yourself if you'd like to. I don't know that. Yeah.
I can't say.
Yes,
Oh,
actually,
gotcha.
I watched it. It's a documentary, and you can find it just about anywhere. I think even Netflix has it now. But it tells a story about all of these ballots that are taken that are fake ballots. And they're taken by these people that drive them all over the country and they're all, of course, Democrat votes. And this is, there's thousands and thousands of them, and they're distributed. And the funny part of it is, um, I'm personally aware of the fact that, especially during COVID, we did take ballots like from hospitals and nursing homes, and I offered for my neighbors, although none of them took me up on it, to take their ballot down to the distribute the appropriate box that you would put it in. But that's what this whole movie's all about. And they claim that the whole thing is it's all fraudulent Democrat voters. And that's how Joe Biden won.
Yeah, and I think I will absolutely have to watch that. I think what you've highlighted is something that I think happens a lot, right? Which is some of the systems that we have in place that are safe and secure, to the outsider, or folks who don't know about it, they might just, it might so clearly to them look like, oh, how could this be a secure process? So I remember the first time I voted via affidavit ballot, and the poll worker said, okay, now I'm going to put it in this bag, and then the bag's going to go behind the desk. And I said, what? Like, that doesn't seem like a process. But then when I looked into it, and I learned this bag is locked. This bag is within a locked container. It's monitored by X, Y, and Z people. And I learned all the different steps that are in place to ensure that it was secure. It made me feel a lot better. And so I think some of this is pre-bunking, right? It's reaching people before they're met with this misinformation about why elections are frauds. Are fraudulent, but it's also learning when to disengage. And some folks who I think are really into X, Y, and Z, and this is what they believe, you're never going to convince those folks otherwise. And so learning
we actually have a very popular talk show host that everybody has to listen to if you live in our state, because we only have one. Who claims that this is all true, which
wow. Okay. So a very public platform.
Yeah.
That's really interesting, right? So I would have to think about that, right? It's reaching so many people. So I think you'd have to look at who is her, what media entity is this, who owns that media entity. Think about how you can kind of escalate this or bring it to a larger scale to kind of highlight that this is
the problem is
not
it's
factual.
difficult to know who to alert it to.
I know.
The one thing that, Erica, I think when we talked about this when we were developing those election security materials a couple of years ago, was we didn't want to look like the bad guys, like we were arguing with whoever was, spreading all of these rumors. We didn't want to look like we were attacking other people or we were, doing it. And I think that's why, Erica, in your presentation, when you talk about pre-bunking and some of those things and dealing, just state the facts. Don't refer to whatever they said, but instead state what the true facts are and try and distribute those. And I think that's why we were so successful, and we were just really trying not to look like we were on the attack either. So that, that was one of our reasonings for doing it that way. Martha's asking, Erica, do you have the PSA that you referenced on US? Do you have a link? Do you know off the top? Or just so for everyone to know, we have recorded this. We'll send it all out. We will also send the materials and any information tomorrow. Martha, thank you for she put in the link in the chat for the US Civic Listening Training. So she did put that in if anyone else would like to see that. And then if we can we'll get the PSA link so that people can see that.
Yeah. I just want to say, Laura, I think you make a really good point, and I just want to highlight that right there is an example of maybe something you shouldn't do, but that is so. My first thought was, great. How do we escalate this? How do we take it to the top so everybody knows this information isn't accurate? But you've really got to take a step back and really think about, okay, what impact is that going to have, and how effective is it going to be? And I just want to highlight Laura's, that our approach was right, presenting the facts. And not arguing with folks is typically the way to go. But it is scary when it's on such a public stage. So
well, and it's so tempting. You want to argue, and you want to tell them they're wrong, but it doesn't always make you look like you're in a good light, and you're probably, as Erica was saying on some of the slides, is probably not going to convince them. So that's why just the facts is what we kind of decided on some of our information. The other thing we did, and I know in Delaware there aren't as many local leagues, but when Erica was talking about the door-to-door impersonation that was happening and the talking at town hall meetings and things like that, we did talk to the US League, and with their help, we drafted a letter that we sent out to all of our local leagues. And we said, this is happening. Please be careful. But if you hear this happening, please report it to us. And then we're actually reporting to US when we hear these, and they're figuring out or giving us advice if we should do anything about it. We're also in constant contact with the State Board of Elections. We let them know if we hear that something's happening that shouldn't be happening. As I keep calling them bad actors, and they keep popping up in different parts of New York State. But that was something we did. And so we gave guidance to all of our local presidents and the local leaders. And we said, okay, this is what's happening. Watch out for this, and then report it to us. Because some of them were like, well, we want to go and we want to, do this and do this. And we said, okay, report it to us, and then we'll have the conversation with US, who is in consultation with some pro bono attorneys and all on this. And they then gave us advice back how to respond to some of this, the bad actors. So that's something in Delaware you might want to, if there's some way to put together some kind of, and Tiffany, we're happy to share with you that letter. If you wanted to, have any members or leaders, whatever, who see bad actors or bad actions happening, report them to you, so that you're keeping kind of a log, or you're kind of watching or seeing what's happening in different parts of the state. And then, as I said, Karen Short at US has been really responsive and helpful to us when, and she's actually coming to our council meeting. For those of you who don't know yet, from New York, she's going to speak at our council meeting about a little bit about this miss and dis, but hopefully more on, as I call them, kind of the bad actors who are actually doing things, not just spreading mis and disinformation, but actually impersonating Board of Elections officers and things like that around New York State. So she's going to speak at our council meeting on that, and she's been very helpful to us. So we keep track of it, and we try and ask for US to help us and see, should we respond? How should we respond? And things like that. So for you in Delaware, I would encourage you to, to talk about that if you've seen those kind of actions in your state as well. Sorry, that's my
I just plugged into the chat the link to the US Democracy Truth Project, which has a list of all the PSAs that you can use, as well as a number of other really good resources. But
right.
As Laura said, they've absolutely been super helpful to us during this process.
Yeah. So I'm not seeing any other questions in the chat. If anyone wants to raise their electronic hand, if they have one they want to, say orally, or if you want questions in the chat. But I don't see any others, or if I missed some, I apologize.
I think you got them all, Laura.
Thanks, Tiffany. Yeah. So as I said, we will share all this information, this recording, this PowerPoint that Eric did. As she said early on, she took a lot of it from US. So on the US website, they do have good information on mis and disinformation. If you want to look there, and we will share we'll share the election security information that we created too, even though you would have to, in Delaware, you'd have to figure out. But it just gives you an example of what it really worked well for us. And we're doing it again this year. We're going to be using those materials again. So yeah, I think that's about it, Tiffany, unless you have some last comments. Thank you, Erica, for presenting it again.
Yeah, I just wanted to thank you both. That was a fantastic presentation, Erica, very informative. I think everyone probably went away with lots of things to think about, especially the tools for when to engage and when not to. I think that will become more and more of an issue as we get closer to November. But yes, thank you both so much. We are very appreciative of all the resources too that you're willing to provide us with. So,
Great. Well, it's
thank
great to
you.
meet you all, and hope we can do something together in the future too.
Definitely.
Thanks, everyone.
for spending
Thank
your
you, Erica. Thank you, Laura.
Yep. Have a good night.